One time, a long time ago, roughly around 1984, Nintendo wanted to do it. They were tired of dealing with the arcade high-score romp-up platforming games and wanted to expand further. In the midst of working on Super Mario Bros., a game focused on its linearity and platforming, Nintendo was also working on another game with a similar plot, but one that didn't follow the design philosophy of Super Mario Bros. A game that had barely any platforming, and one that focused more on exploration than reaching an objective goal through a quick linear pathway. Through the mind of Miyamoto and his young past wandering through the gardens and forests of Kyoto, along with the writings and concepts of folklore Europe and Japan, all of these ideas would culminate into what would become The Legend of Zelda.
The Legend of Zelda left such a strong impact on the gaming industry at the time. It encouraged this wide open sandbox of exploration while also having very strategic forms of combat. Like, strategic in the sense of having to go around your opponent to actually attack them. I mean, it is kind of strategic both in-game and in real life to try to stab someone without getting hurt, so I guess there is an argument for that. It was also ranked as a must-have for the Nintendo Entertainment System and sold 6.5 million copies, which was something else for a non-launch title NES game. But let's understand this. This was an open-world adventure NES game, and given how Nintendo usually performed when developing games, you know damn well that they would try to push it to make it worth its price. The overworld in this game is huge for its time, and has different subsections so that it usually doesn't feel like you're traveling around in only one biome. However, because of the needs to make this game huge in design, including the dungeons, a lot of stuff had to be sacrificed or used very infrequently in order to achieve the results they were desiring. And I feel that some of these design choices ended up weakening the game overall.
Now let me start off with saying that I am not a Zelda fan. Well, not yet. I've only played 2 games up until this one and only completed 1 before this one. So that should tell you something about how I feel about this franchise. Well, less about the franchise and more about its genre. The action-adventure genre I like. The RPG genre I'm a little mixed on. And with open world, that's when it becomes selective, especially depending on its usage and whether they take good advantage of it or not. I do like me an open world sandbox where I can do whatever I damn well please, but if that sandbox is just this huge lump of land with nothing besides small rocks and maybe an occasional treasure or object spotter, then I don't consider this ones that are taking advantage of well, even if they have different terrains or biomes.
Let's just see if the first Zelda game could take advantage of its open world design. I mean, how bad could a Zelda game be? One that was made in 1986 for the NES with a max capacity 8-bit processor.
Booting up the game, you're greeted with this title screen before moving on to the name selection. Yes, I did name my character Poontang, but I'll just keep it on the down low and call him Link for the video. Followed by you being booted into this Trifork area with a cave spot. You go into the cave, get the sword from this old man, and then, yep, that's it. Good luck on your own. I mean, just a few screens up, you can reach this water spot that has a bridge leading to the first dungeon, but otherwise, beyond that, it's pretty much exploration on your own. You do kind of have a map, but it's more so a screen indicator on what screen position you'd be on now. No. What we're gonna need is a guide for this run.
Oh, fuck me. I guess it's come to this. I guess I should explain my position on guides, or at least using external sources as a means of completing a game.
And before I get into this whole debacle, let me just say this clearly. I do not care if you use a guide, whether that be the easiest game in the world or the hardest game in the world. So long as it makes your game time more enjoyable, then go ahead and use one as much as you want. This is purely talking about its use as a necessity in game design. Now on the topic of guides, it depends on its role in the game. If it's some computer game that can allow immediate access to the resources, or one of those ARG cryptid type games that make you comb through 1,000 websites, those are still pretty annoying, but I mean it's more so their thing, so usually I'd have to let it not cross my mind too much as a nuisance. I also don't bash games that require a guide for 100% so long as there's no real reward to 100%ing the game. I know that may sound dumb, but at that point 100%ing a game with no real reward is really just for bragging rights and not like a necessity to actually finish the game up. Which is why I don't downplay games like Super Mario Sunshine, which requires an extensive guide to 100% a game. However, since 100% is optional and not required to beat the game, it doesn't affect my opinion on the main priority of the game and its design. It also depends for me on how much one has to be used to consider if it has an effect on the game's design. Take for example some of my more recent playthroughs. Super Mario Bros. Versus Super Mario Bros. The Lost Levels. In Super Mario Bros., I only really needed to pull up a level guide once for a single castle just to get around the warp hallway. While with the Lost Levels, I essentially needed a guide for every level beyond World 5 involving a warp point, which is why I heavily criticized the game beyond its weak level design as needing an external source to figure out the game, though you won't be seeing that for another few weeks. Even games I am very fond of, like Earthbound and Eternal Darkness, still dwell on me for needing a guide in some of its sections. Well, at least Earthbound did come with a guide when it first launched, so if a game is going to require a guide, it should only be for a brief moment if absolutely necessary, not be the means to ride through a whole game, because what's the fun in that? I'm not advocating for a linear design to this, just add stuff that would make things less subtle or harder to figure out. It's not that difficult. And yes, I get it, this was made in 1985 when games were still just being figured out. If the map was really troublesome to try and detail out, why not add more noticeable landmarks to know where you're going? Or make a part of the wall, bush, or cave darker in shade or color than the rest? Why make everything so fucking samey and similar? I don't want to pull up a guide for more than half of my playthrough. I should be able to figure out the game by myself without having to play a guessing game of which individual tile can you interact with. This isn't goddamn Minesweepers Deluxe, dude. And listen, just because a game was the first in the series does not mean it's immune from sorts of criticism. You can still acknowledge its legacy while discussing its issues and flawed design choices. If a first series game were to be immune from criticism, then that would mean I would have to completely praise Super Mario Kart. And there's no way in fuck you'll ever catch me considering that game one of the best or even top 7 at best. So no, I don't understand why people consider this among the best in the series. It's not even that great, and I do mean great in that sentence. So anyways, I decided to mostly guide through myself for the beginning segment of the game, as you'll be needing to collect a lot of items before expanding to the dungeons, although you could possibly make it through dungeon 1 and 2 with your starting kit. It's better safe than sorry to upgrade a bit beforehand. Most of the items needed need to be bought, which can be done by collecting rupees. These sort of crystals with economic value that can be used to buy stuff like bombs, potions, shields, sword upgrades, amongst other sorts of items available on the overworld. You get rupees from either killing off enemies like Octoroks, and Levers. Can someone get this ass hat off of my video, please? Or you can get them from entering secret caves, which will usually have some old man or pug dog looking guard that gives them to you. Although sometimes you'll get assholes like this guy who forces you to pay him for knocking down his own cave door. Well, fuck you too, you little asshole. I was trying to get you some light in here, but apparently you're as much of a basement dweller as a redditor. Of course, these secret caves are, well, secrets, with most of them requiring bombs to get to open or this flame that shoots out of this funky looking candle, which of course means needing a guide for most of these, especially since some of these give you fat stacks of rupees that'll definitely be required for later upgrades. I mean, I can't deny that the world map isn't being used to its advantage. Almost every screen has some sort of secret, special location, or unique terrain amongst the prevailing apricot background, but most of these are hidden amongst lines of walls, bushes, or graves that can't be usually found without a guide or wasting hours of grinding and trial and error to achieve and hopefully write it somewhere to remember. Yeah, the secret caves are kept permanently on the map and can be used as landmarks to where you are, but I still would have liked some sort of landmark that are already present from the start on each location and a hint system that would tell you where to find secret locales or what to do next on your journey. Because honest to God, who was to be defined as the old lady when there are many old ladies hiding in the caves? Like I said, I think the open world environment is being taken advantage of, but if they were more open about it, then I wouldn't have to rely on a guide to help figure out what areas I need to be in, what key areas I'll need to get to in order to obtain an item or upgrade, or find items kept in secret that are required to progress forward. Guys, I get it. Want the game to feel like an adventure and want people to feel rewarded for discovering something so pivotal that'll help them advance forward. But some of these requirements I would have never gotten them as a kid. Seriously, even if they designed the exploration system to be reliant on trial and error and to be persistent throughout the game, it's just too damn much of it. Kids would have most likely exhausted themselves after trying every option available off their head and probably give up for weeks, maybe even months from trying to play the game again, because how are they to progress on something that won't throw a bone at them every bit?
Of course, we all knew the reason for this was most likely because of this.
Oh, come on, before anyone gets on me about this, just think. Nintendo created Nintendo Power as a means of selling off reliable information, catalogs, and unique products that helped inform those that subscribe to the magazine about current things going on around Nintendo and tabloids on past, present, and future games. Of course, one of the many things thrown into these magazines were hints and guides, with some magazines essentially being guidebooks of their time. You don't want to waste hundreds of hours of your life trialing and erroring your way through the game? That's okay, either tune into the Nintendo hotline, assuming you had a telephone line and not living in Hicktown, Nebraska. Call up the number and sit there for 5 minutes waiting to talk to the right person, and just hope he understands what you're talking about and gives you the right hint at that moment in the game. Or go get mommy and daddy's credit card that you totally won't forget to discharge after the month, and you'll get an easy route to finishing up this game. Come on, it was a genius business move. And although I couldn't find a graph or business document of the sort, it wouldn't surprise me if Nintendo Power subscriptions increased heavily when the Zelda magazines were published. I think another issue is the travel length. If you die at any point in your journey outside of a dungeon, you get sent all the way back to your starting spot on the overworld. And since there's no warp or short route to any spot on the map, that means walking all the way back to your last spot, all the while defeating or avoiding enemies and collecting a small value of currency that will hopefully be useful for later. Now that I think about it, I think I've played another game that had a similar problem akin to this. Yeah, what am I even talking about? I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm just babbling on about how dumb this game is. Dumb, 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 stupid, smelly, dumb video game, dumb, dumb.
Okay, I know I've been fucking ragging on the game, but you gotta understand, a lot of the issues I'm taking against this game are ones that are core values of the game. You know, it's not like my usual knick-knack 2-minute rant about some pretty bullshit mechanic or feature in a game. No, this is like genuinely ruining my gameplay experience. Why do I need to pull out an entire guide to run through most of everything in this game outside of like the 5 beginning dungeons? I'd rather have the cave dwellers give me a more direct hint to where I need to go next or what I need to do that isn't some vague blotch of text that needs to be cracked by the fucking Enigma code. Sure, it may potentially hamper the feelings of exploring the game bit by bit, but I'd rather take more directful hints in it. It means the game can be done at my own guide and decision. This is definitely one of the weakest aspects of this game, and I do feel that in some way or another it could have been dealt with even with the technological limitations at the time. But after getting all of that off my chest, now we can start looking at some of the more positive aspects of the games, or at least the ones that made my gameplay experience much more enjoyable.
Once you manage to deal with the repeated deaths and over-exploration of the overworld to get what you need, the game actually starts getting fun at this point. You start getting accustomed to the overworld, which in turn means it becomes harder to get lost, and with a more upgraded kit, hordes of enemies are a breeze to deal with, at least in the overworld, because when it comes to where we're going next, it's a bit polarizing. That's right, now we're going into the dungeon run phase of this game. Once you pick up the magic shield and blue ring, this is where the real adventure begins. There exists 9 dungeons in the game, each one increasing in difficulty by numbered order. One thing about this game is that in sticking with its true open world philosophy, you can access any of these dungeons at any time once you've gotten most of the required overworld items. Which is how I accidentally ran into the 8th dungeon before noping the fuck out of there upon seeing this. Each dungeon holds a shard of the Triforce. Oh, I guess I didn't get around to explaining the story, so I'll go by it briefly. There existed 2 Triforces in the kingdom, the Triforce of Wisdom and the Triforce of Power. Don't ask where the third one is, that'll be for a later time. Ganon holds the Triforce of Power, and Princess Zelda of Hyrule holds the Triforce of Wisdom, but destroys and scatters them across Hyrule in order to avoid Ganon from getting his grubby little trotters on it. Ganon still kidnaps Zelda and sends his goons out to retrieve it, who now guard the shards of the Triforce in 8 of the 9 dungeons. I'm assuming that the doorway is super super locks, so their only goal is to grind up Link into human chum, because otherwise what's stopping them from just opening the door and grabbing it? So yes, that is our mission. Gather the 8 shards, reach the final dungeon, give Ganon a can of whoop ass, and rescue Zelda. Simple as stated. All dungeons have 3 things in them. A map, which will reveal the layout of the dungeon on the menu above. Some of these layouts are definitely questionable, to say the least. What I don't get is the fact that the dungeons have a proper map system, but not the overworlds. I mean, yeah, it's not a lot, but at least it shows, like, the room that I'm in. Like, come on, man, you could have added the dividers and called it a day. The other item being the compass, which will help reveal the location of the Triforce within the dungeon. And the third is some surprise Mouska tool that will help us later. Although sometimes there may be more than one surprise Mouska tool in some of these later game dungeons. Many of the dungeons will slowly reveal different kinds of enemies never seen in the overworld. Some of these guys have different alternative colors. Usually you'll see red or orange skin of these kinds in the early dungeons, but as you progress you'll start running into blue skin versions of the enemies, which either have better health, deal more damage, or has a smarter AI system tied to it. The blue Dark Nut is the worst of the bunch because of its combination in all 3 aspects mentioned above, which makes dealing with them a bitch, especially if you have to rely on your melee range swords because you lost the projectile sword from an earlier hit, because taking even half a heart off will literally deny you use of it, which I think is fucked, but apparently this carries on over to later Zelda titles, so I don't know, maybe it's just the unfair balance between enemies in the room and your reaction time, with how long it takes to shoot the beams in between each button press. Also doesn't help Dark Nuts always hold shields, so you can't just try and shoot them from a distance. The best way I've dealt with Dark Nuts is usually jabbing at them, and if I happen to take a hit, just run up and stab, and hopefully the hitbox detection will let you land a hit. Sometimes if you're on the side of them, you can kind of do this side spin when you first pull your sword out and then immediately pressing any other direction on the D-pad, which will allow Link to turn around while holding out the sword for a few more frames. Much better tactic than just running into them and hoping for the best. However, despite how annoying Dark Nuts are, they cannot bring me to a level of rage as much as these Manhandla does. You know why this fucking asshole has only appeared once in the series? Well, I'll tell you why. So, at first, the Manhandla is the boss of the 3rd dungeon, a formidable foe that gives that feeling of graciousness when you defeat him, but instead of just making him the boss on the 1 dungeon and calling it quits, instead they decide that he should be a reoccurring mini-boss in later dungeons. Those being the 4th one and the 8th one. Manhandla in the 4th dungeon is a bit of a nuisance even with the bombs, since he's placed pretty late into the dungeon and he has these statues that shoot out beams at you. But then you get to the 8th dungeon and oh man does it suck, because you have to deal with him 3 times in that dungeon. What the fuck? In fact, these statues are some of the most annoying obstacles in the game. They always seem to be in heavy loaded enemy rooms or boss rooms and just always knock each of your hearts out slowly while you're trying to deal with these dipshit enemies. And you can't even destroy them or anything. It's so annoying. The 8th dungeon may be the worst dungeon in all of Zelda. It's bordering on Ghosts and Goblins level of difficulty. I don't think I've died more in a single dungeon than this one. Not even the final dungeon. It's the dungeon of not only Manhandlas, but Blue Dark Nuts too, with some rooms being Dark Nut only rooms. Well, fuck me sideways on a stick. You also have some other mini bosses like this Cyclop crab looking monster, which requires you to get the bow and arrow in order to take out with perfect precision. Can't jab him here. And the most challenging boss of the game, the 4-headed Gleeok, with each head of course forming a ghostly beam shooting version after being taken off the body. Not only that, but it's also where bombs start becoming a necessity and finding new routes and sections to the next room, including the damn boss room. And there's no mark or distinction on the wall to place the bomb at. You once again will need the guide for this area just to get to places. God, I have never felt so exhausted and so gratified at the same time the moment I grabbed that fucking Triforce piece. This may honestly be the make it or break it dungeon for most players. Despite the very infuriating enemy placements and layout of some few dungeons, I can't help but just take a liking to them. The atmospheric level in these dungeons is quite intimidating yet ambitious. The way you slowly uncover each room from the pitch blackness, the close quarter combat situations you're forced into against a lot of the foes, the roar of the nearby boss as you get closer and closer to the Triforce area. The music on this level is genius and really gets that level of courageousness into your mentality, even though you know it's not going to be an easy fight. The music is especially something here. It's a very short song repetitively looped over and over again and used in 8 out of the 9 dungeons, but for some reason it always holds that impact towards me regardless of when I'm just entering, restarting after a death, healing back up, or even leaving to go find resources to come back more prepared. It's such a fitting song for the atmosphere in these dungeons, and I couldn't find it working in any other game regardless of similarity unlike this one. It's like it was meant for this game style at the time. Of course, once you manage to collect all pieces of the Triforce of Wisdom and get all the necessities in each dungeon, including some of the optional stuff like the magical key to make your journey easier, you begin heading off to the final dungeon, hiding in plain sight in Death Mountain. The final dungeon is the largest dungeon in the game and the most challenging one at that, though I wouldn't call it the most difficult one, as it requires more of your patience and critical thinking to get around here rather than your precision and attack rate. Now luckily there are 2 routes when it comes to the final dungeon, one that involves the magical key and one that doesn't. The magical key route is a much shorter route to the way of Ganon's lair, only requiring a few bomb holes and obviously quite the staircases to travel about. The other route is a much longer and grueling route to serve as punishment for not picking up the magical key. But hey, if you like grinding for rupees and hearts, then maybe it's a more fun route for you. It also leads to a much more direct path towards the red ring unless you fall back a bit if you're doing the magical key route. If you take fat damage when fighting enemies in Sooner Ganon, then I'd recommend picking it up. You are going to need it. Either way, both routes will force you to pick up the silver arrow since that is the only weapon that can defeat Ganon. Unfortunately, before you go to Ganon, you'll have to deal with a lot of enemies beforehand. Now, before you freak out and put Zelda in your top 5 hardest NES games, this final dungeon contains no Dark Nuts or Manhandlas. Instead, this final dungeon contains a fuck ton of Wizrobes, both orange and blue, and introduces 2 new enemies, the Lanmolas, which are pathetic, and this mini-boss-like enemy called Patra, who is a bitch to deal with 3 times. A bitch that needs to be dealt with 3 times. God, it's like even when they make it this far, they still didn't want kids to try and beat this game. Whatever, I'd take on 3 Patras over 3 Manhandlas any day of the week. Anyways, once you defeat the final Patra, you can make your way to the final room against Ganon. Wow, he's easy. Like, damn, he's easy even at your worst point. Well, maybe not at your worst point, because that would mean no Master Sword, no Triforce pieces, and no Silver Arrow, which means you wouldn't be able to finish him. Okay, you know what I mean. The dungeon felt more like the final boss than Ganon himself. Just sit around in one corner of the room and go crazy with the jabbing until eventually he's knocked cold. Then shoot him with the arrow and... Damn. Is that shit or a literal pile of blood dust? Anyways, after you easily whoop Ganon and grab the Triforce of Power, you make your way... Oh, don't forget to put out the fire. You make your way to Zelda, reunite with the Triforce pieces, and reveal them together before your journey ends there. No, I am not doing the second quest. But it is there if you want to try it. Just like with Super Mario Bros., you get a harder version of the same game. More enemies on screen, much more difficult to find secret spots, as if the beginning adventure already didn't have enough of those. And of course, more dungeon enemies. Christ, could you imagine the 8th dungeon on the second quest? I think I'd rather play Super Mario Bros. The Lost Levels 100 times over before I take that on.
Wow. That was quite an adventure. I still hold that this game is not a good game. This is one acclaimed game I consider to have aged badly from the beginning. I seriously could not understand how any kid or even adult would have ever figured this out without the help of some guidebook or friends to pass secrets and tips along. It's a guide game through and through, which is inherently a flawed game design. No game should ever require you to need an external source to get yourself through a game unless it's tied to the game's core mechanics. Which even then, most games that do have that usually come packaged with the accessory at hand. However, to give credit where credit is due, once you actually understand the locales of the game and are properly equipped, it actually starts becoming an adventurous experience. A challenging one at that, but still, the dungeons were actually some of the most intriguing locations I've ever ran through in early video games, with most dungeons reaching a decent level of fair play to where you would likely be at that point in the journey. It also has a good sense of exploration when the game actually gives you a real hint that can be translated well into the game. And I feel that each time I cleared a dungeon out, I was not only relieved to have finished through that, but also kind of feeling more determined and ready to go die trying than before. Something that a lot of adventure games don't really pull off in that same sense. Really, even though this game isn't the ideal Zelda game, it unintentionally set the bar so low that every other game in the similar genre that came after it would be so spectacular in comparison. It would be a complete upgrade from this game because just so much problems were in this game that they couldn't have fixed it in time, whether that's because of technological limitations or had to sacrifice it in order to appeal to what they were really trying to go for at the time. It really makes you think, what would it be like? How would the other games be held up if they somehow were to have tweaked this game to be good upon release? Not like a remake or anything, upon release. Well, for now, we're not going to be looking at any more Zelda games. Just kind of wanted to look at this one, get it over with. The next few games, though, and yes, I said few games, we'll actually be looking at 3 games, will involve a sort of accessory. Maybe not the accessory itself, because I don't have an original NES, but you'll see sometime later. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and grab myself some milk.